Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The rain had come down all morning like it was trying to wash the city clean. Rivers ran along the curbs of Maple Street, sweeping cigarette butts and soggy flyers into storm drains. The Crestmont Hotel rose above it all, immaculate and untouched, its gleaming glass facade mirroring the stormy sky. Inside, the warmth of gold chandeliers and velvet carpet muffled any whisper of weather beyond the doors. Business people in press suits checked in with effortless entitlement. A pianist in the corner played something light and familiar. The concierge smiled on cue, and not one soul noticed the tall, weathered man standing beneath the awning outside, watching through the glass. Malcolm Reed had not stepped into a place like the Crestmont in over 4 decades. The last time he did, he wore a 3-piece suit and a wedding band, his eyes filled with plans for the future. Today, his coat was tattered, boots cracked and soaked through, and his beard grown wild with time. Yet there was something in his posture that hadn't changed, a kind of steady resolve that didn't ask permission. He took one step forward, then another. Rain pooled on the marble floor behind him as he crossed the threshold. The lobby quieted. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, a man out of place, a figure soaked in rain and time. His eyes scanned the room like someone returning to a childhood home, trying to recognize the bones beneath the paint. "Sir," said a young woman at the front desk, her voice professional, if a bit uncertain. He looked at her, then past her to the mahogany wall behind where a new brass plaque read, "Owned and operated by Andrew Whitaker Holdings." "This hotel," he said calmly, "belongs to me." A hush fell. Conversations tapered into uncomfortable silence. The pianist stopped mid-phrase. Laughter came next, a scattered, reflexive chorus of disbelief. Not cruel at first, just dismissive. A guest near the espresso bar chuckled into his cup. Another turned to his companion with an arched brow. Security moved quickly. A tall white man in a navy blazer and radio clipped to his shoulder approached Malcolm with a hand raised in practiced diplomacy. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, sir." Malcolm didn't flinch. He reached slowly into the canvas satchel slung across his shoulder. Every security eye in the room tightened. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was an old document, creased and yellowed, protected in a clear plastic sleeve. A land deed. The ink had faded, but the name beneath the ornate signature was still visible. Malcolm Isaiah Reed. He held it out with care. "My father and I bought this land in 1972. We built the original Crestmont with our own hands. Before it had marble. Before it had a pianist." The security guard didn't take the paper. Instead, he signaled a second man to join him. Within moments, Malcolm was flanked. "You need to go," one said. "I have the right to be here." "Not dressed like that, you don't." The second guard snatched the deed from Malcolm's hand and looked it over, lips curling into a smirk. "This is ancient," he scoffed. "Where do you print this? A museum?" The first guard shoved open the heavy door. "Out. Now." They didn't manhandle him, but they made it clear it could go that way. And Malcolm, for all his pride, understood leverage. He stepped backward, one slow movement at a time, until the hotel's warm glow was behind him and the storm had welcomed him back. He stood still for a moment under the pounding rain. The deed lay damp in his hand now, the plastic cover no longer fully protecting it. He looked up at the towering hotel. Its windows gleamed like a fortress. Then, from somewhere deep inside, he whispered, "You know who I am. You always have." As he turned and walked down the steps, his boots leaving muddy ghosts behind him, a figure inside the lobby kept watching. Her name was Tessa Rowe. She'd been manning the concierge desk since dawn, fighting sleep with bitter coffee and the same playlist she always used to drown out her doubts. But when the man had entered, drenched, deliberate, she had stopped everything. And when he held up that deed, something in her chest stirred, because she'd seen that name before, somewhere in the basement archive, in a folder no one ever opened. A folder labeled Reed and Whitaker, 1972 to 1987. She looked toward the door, now dripping rain and silence. Then back at the front desk, where the guards had left the deed, wet and half forgotten. Tessa reached for it, careful not to draw attention, and slipped it beneath her appointment book. Outside, Malcolm Reed disappeared into the rain. But not away. Never again away. He was going home. The first believers. The rain had passed, but the memory of it clung to Grace Holloway like the scent of something long buried. Even as the lobby of the Crestmont Hotel returned to its usual rhythm, bellboys darting between elevators, laughter rising like steam from the bar, and the polished shoes of executives clicking across marble, she couldn't forget the look in the old man's eyes. Malcolm Reed. That was the name he'd given before security dragged him out into the storm like so much refuse. Grace had watched it all from behind the front desk, her hands frozen above the keyboard, the welcome script dying on her lips. It wasn't just the audacity of what he'd said. This hotel belongs to me. It was the way he said it. Not in anger, not with entitlement, but with a steadiness that didn't waver even when he was laughed at, jeered, and shoved. Now, hours later, Grace stood in the employee break room holding a cup of tea she hadn't sipped. Across from her, Miguel Alvarez leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, his blue maintenance jumpsuit streaked with the day's labors. "You saw his face, right?" Grace asked. Miguel nodded slowly. "I did." Looked like he knew something the rest of us forgot. "I don't know what it is, but..." She hesitated, pressing the cup to her lips and lowering it again. It didn't feel like he was lying. "No, Miguel agreed." And the way he held that document, like it wasn't paper, like it was his last heartbeat. They stood in silence for a moment before Grace glanced toward the hallway leading to the records room. "You still have that key?" she asked. Miguel cracked a smile. "You mean the one I'm definitely not supposed to have?" Of course. The old archives room hadn't been touched in years. It smelled of paper, dust, and the faintest trace of lemon cleaner. Boxes were stacked like forgotten tombstones, each labeled with dates and codes only someone like Miguel could decode. He flicked on a portable lantern and set it on the table in the center of the room. "This place predates digital records," he said, "and no one's digitizing stuff from the 70s unless they're told to. Which means if your guy was telling the truth, we might find it here." Grace moved carefully, running her fingers along boxes labeled 1971, 1972, 1973. "He said the hotel was his," she murmured. And that document looked old, yellowed, edges curled, like it had been through something. They worked in silence, digging through files that crackled with age. Half an hour passed, then another. Grace found herself slowing, the weight of doubt creeping in. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd once worked here. Maybe he wasn't well. Then she heard Miguel let out a sharp breath. "Grace, look at this." He held out a thick manila folder labeled Crestmont Holdings 1972. Inside, typed on a faded document stamped with the hotel's original seal, were the words: "Property registration, Crestmont Hotel, Lot 43B co-owners, Charles Whitmore and Malcolm Reed." Grace blinked. "No, that can't be right." Miguel held it up to the lantern. "It's right. Look, that's Charles Whitmore, Preston's grandfather. Everyone knows that name. But this means Malcolm wasn't just connected. He was part of it. This was his hotel." Grace sat heavily into the nearest chair. "But if that's true, then why doesn't anyone know his name?" Miguel shook his head. Maybe someone wanted it that way. They fell into silence again, broken only by the hum of the building above them. The weight of the truth settled between them. "You know what this means, right?" Grace finally said. "If this is real, then the hotel doesn't just have a missing name. It has a stolen story." Later that night, Grace lay in bed staring at her ceiling fan. The apartment above her thumped faintly with late-night footsteps. But all she could think about was the look in Malcolm Reed's eyes. How it mirrored the ache she'd seen in her grandfather when he spoke of land he once owned but lost. It wasn't about money. It was about erasure. The next morning, she returned to the archives with a camera and scanned the document. Miguel arrived with coffee and a folder of notes he'd started keeping. "Asked my uncle about Whitmore," he said. "Turns out Charles Whitmore made his first fortune flipping black-owned properties in the 60s and 70s. Urban renewal, they called it. But everyone in the neighborhood knew what it really was." Grace frowned. So maybe Malcolm wasn't just erased. Maybe he was targeted. Miguel nodded grimly. They stared at the scanned copy together. The name, Malcolm Reed, burning brighter now that it had once been so close to disappearing. What do we do? Grace asked. Miguel looked at her. We find him. Grace exhaled slowly, feeling something shift within her. Not a burden, a calling. Let's bring his name back. The search for Malcolm Reed had begun, and with it, the unraveling of a story the city had tried to forget. The next morning brought no sunlight, just a flat, gray sky hanging low over the city like a held breath. Inside the small break room, tucked behind the staff hallway of the Crestmont Hotel, Grace Holloway sat hunched, over a cup of lukewarm coffee. Her fingers traced the rim, mind still tangled in the night before its discovery. You ever feel like you're standing on a story no one's finished telling? She murmured aloud, mostly to herself. All the time, Miguel replied, stepping in with a cardboard box in his arms. His dark curls were damp from the drizzle outside, and a streak of dust ran across his cheek like a quiet battle scar from the archive room. Grace looked up. You found something? Miguel set the box down gently on the table, careful not to jostle its fragile contents. Old payroll ledgers, property maps, and this. He reached in and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, cracked and worn, the edges curled like leaves pressed between pages too long. Grace took it with reverence. The initials MR were faint but still there. They opened the book together. Inside was a life, not in chapters but in moments. Scraps of dates and names, sketches of the hotel's facade from various corners of the street, observations of who entered, who left, who looked like they belonged, and who didn't. Newspaper clippings pasted in with careful fingers. Names underlined. Occasions noted in block letters. Whitmore Foundation Gala denied entry. Daughter's 18th birthday. Watched from across street. Grace blinked fast. He's been watching for decades. They buried him, Miguel said softly. But he never stopped looking back. They flipped to a page dated 1997. A small entry, no more than a few lines, but the neatness of the penmanship stood out. Saw Preston today. Spitting image of Charles at that age. Smiled like he owned everything. Maybe he does. Maybe that's what they taught him. Grace swallowed hard. They took everything from him. His name, his work, his family. And we walked past him every day, Miguel added, thinking he was just another man in the street. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not empty. There was something sacred in that pause, like standing inside a church no one had prayed in for years. Later that day, they returned to the archive room, a basement space that smelled of damp wood and decades-old secrets. Miguel flipped through more boxes. Grace held the notebook like it was glass. What do we do with this? She asked. We tell his story. To who? The hotel? The press? Miguel hesitated. To the people who need to hear it first. To us. To anyone who ever believed they didn't matter. Grace looked down at the notebook, then nodded. Then we start here. That evening, she walked 2 blocks from her apartment to the church on Fulton Avenue. Malcolm often sat on the steps, rain or shine, his burlap sack beside him like a faithful old dog. Tonight, he was there, coat buttoned wrong, a styrofoam cup of coffee steaming between his palms. Mr. Reed, she said gently. He looked up. His eyes were alert but cautious, as if each interaction came with a question he hadn't yet decided to ask. I read your notes, Grace continued. She sat beside him, not waiting for permission. I didn't know. About the hotel. About you. He gave a half-smile. Most folks don't. You kept watching all these years. Not much else a man can do when the world takes his name. She reached into her bag and handed him the notebook. We want to help. Miguel and I. We think people need to know the truth. Not just about the building. About the man who built it. Malcolm held the notebook in his weathered hands, silent. You kept the past alive, she said. Now maybe it's time we bring it back to light. He looked at her, long and quiet. You sure you want to follow a ghost through history, Miss Holloway? Not a ghost, she replied. A man who never got to finish his story. The rain began again, soft and steady. Malcolm stared out at the wet pavement, where lamplight shimmered like candle flames. Then, slowly he nodded. All right, he said, almost a whisper. Let's begin. And in that moment, a man thought forgotten found his name again. Not on a plaque, not in a ledger, but in the hearts of two young people who refused to let the truth stay buried. The rain hadn't let up since morning. It slid down the windows of the bus terminal like slow tears, drawing blurred shadows of passing figures on the glass. Grace Holloway sat curled near the corner bench, her coat pulled tightly around her, a scarf wrapped high around her chin. She watched the rain, her breath shallow, her fingers curled around an envelope that had arrived anonymously at the front desk of the Crestmont Hotel the night before. No note, just a photo. It was of her and Miguel, crouched over an archive box in the basement, faces lit by flashlight. The timestamp was from 2 nights ago. The image made her stomach twist. She had felt it then, a shift in the air, the uncanny silence, the flicker of motion in her periphery. But they had been too deep in the story to heed it. They know, Grace whispered to herself. She hadn't been able to reach Miguel since yesterday evening. His phone rang once, then straight to voicemail. She'd gone by his apartment on her lunch break. The lights were off. His bike, the one he rode everywhere, was still chained outside the stairwell. Grace had knocked for 10 minutes before the neighbor cracked the door and mumbled, "He left in a rush last night." Didn't say where. Grace's hands trembled now, not just from fear, but from anger, from knowing the past wasn't just buried under dust and bad memory, but under power, the kind that smiled in public and pressed a knife against your ribs in the dark. Behind her, footsteps. She turned fast. It was Malcolm Reed. His clothes were cleaner now, a navy wool coat buttoned high, his beard trimmed. He looked older under the bus station's harsh light, the years living on the streets etched into every crease of his face. But his posture held something new, not pride, but a kind of return. "You came," he said softly. "I didn't know where else to go." He sat beside her, glancing at the envelope she passed him. He said nothing at first, only stared at the photo as if it were a mirror. Then he folded it and tucked it inside his coat. "They watched me for years," he said, almost a whisper, "but they never feared me. Not until someone else started looking." "Miguel's missing," Grace said. "I think they took him." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Then it begins." She looked at him, heart beating like a drum. "What begins?" "The fight." They left the terminal on foot, under the cover of a black umbrella Malcolm had picked up somewhere. He walked with purpose, leading her down unfamiliar streets, past boarded-up storefronts and graffitied alleyways, until they reached a brick church tucked into a hollow between warehouses. The cross on its roof was rusted. The front doors splintered and chained. But Malcolm led her around the side. He knocked 3 times on a basement door, then twice more. A latch turned. Inside was warmth and quiet. The room smelled of cedar and old books. Cots lined the walls. A kettle hissed on a hot plate. At a folding table sat a woman in her 60s, silver braids wrapped in a scarf. Her eyes landed on Grace, then on Malcolm. "She knows. She believes." The woman rose and extended a hand. "I'm Bernice. We kept records, copies of some. We knew one day he might return." Grace took her hand. It was calloused, warm. That night, by candlelight, Malcolm and Bernice laid out what they had kept hidden. Documents, property records, court transcripts, letters from whistleblowers who had vanished after daring to speak. The ledger was there, too. A handwritten book kept by Charles Whitmore's secretary until her mysterious death in 1992. Names, payments, pressure points, judges, politicians, editors. "They never just took my land," Malcolm said. "They erased me, erased men like me from the history of this city." Grace felt herself grow small under the weight of it, not because she couldn't bear it, but because it demanded reverence. "Why haven't you gone to the press?" Bernice shook her head. "They won't listen. Not without something more. Not until people already believe." Grace nodded slowly. "Then we make them believe. One story at a time." By morning, they had a plan. Grace would return to the Crestmont, act normal, smile at the guests. Pour coffee. But her phone would become a recorder. Every conversation, every whisper, every slip. She would send clips to Bernice, who would catalog and protect them. They would build a case, piece by piece. And Miguel? Malcolm would find him. "He left a breadcrumb," he said. A message on a wall in chalk. Old habit of his. If he's alive, I'll find him. Before they parted, Grace turned to Malcolm. Why me? Why trust me? He looked at her the way a man looks at dawn. Because you didn't flinch when the rain came. You listened. And that's how justice begins. Outside, the clouds had not yet lifted. But the wind had changed. Grace stepped into the morning, knowing the storm was still coming. But now, she wasn't facing it alone. Echoes in the attic. The attic smelled of paper and time. Dust floated in golden shafts of light that streamed through a single circular window. The air was thick, as if every secret the Crestmont Hotel had ever hidden still hung there, waiting to be found. Grace Holloway stood silently, her heart beating fast in her chest. Beside her, Malcolm Reed moved slowly, carefully, like a man stepping back into a house built from memories. It hasn't changed, he murmured. Not a damn thing. The space was a clutter of old filing cabinets, warped wooden shelves, and boxes with faded labels. Beneath years of neglect lay decades of power, wealth, and silence. Somewhere in this forgotten room was the truth. They hadn't come alone. Eleanor Sharp, now in her early 80s but still sharp-eyed and commanding, stood near the door with a flashlight in one hand and her purse clutched tightly in the other. She had been Malcolm's assistant once, before the world turned against him. It had taken Grace days to track her down in a small apartment on the south side. When she answered the door and heard Malcolm's name, her hands had flown to her chest, her breath caught between grief and disbelief. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "Almost," Malcolm had replied. "But I'm still standing." And now here they were, joined by Thomas Green, the night guard at the Crestmont. He had been with the hotel for over 30 years, long enough to see too much and say too little. For decades, he kept his head down, playing the quiet observer. But he never forgot the way they erased Malcolm Reed, not just from the hotel, but from the city's memory. "If what you're looking for is still here," Thomas said, adjusting his cap as he stepped into the attic, "it's going to be in the northern wall cabinets. Back when Charles Whitmore ran things, those files were off-limits to most. They set to work, each drawn by a quiet sense of purpose." Grace opened box after box, coughing through clouds of dust and squinting at brittle papers. Birth certificates, contracts, guest ledgers from the 1940s. Everything was jumbled, unsorted, and slowly crumbling. Hours passed, marked only by the occasional sound of paper fluttering or Eleanor muttering when something caught her eye. Then came the moment. "Here," Eleanor whispered. Her fingers, trembling but precise, pulled a thick manila envelope from behind a false panel in a cabinet. Tom had browned the edges, but the seal was still intact. She opened it with care, as if disturbing a sacred relic. Inside was a single sheet of parchment paper, thick, embossed, and yellow with age. Grace stepped closer, and her breath caught. Malcolm Reed and Charles Whitmore, co-owners. 1972. It was the original land deed. Unaltered, unforged. Malcolm said nothing. His hands took the paper gently, like cradling the past itself. His name was there in black ink. Not a rumor, not a memory, a fact. Thomas let out a low whistle. This is the real thing. They really did it to you." Malcolm nodded, but his face was unreadable. This wasn't vindication. Not yet. It was a doorway, one that led back to pain just as much as it led toward justice. "Keep looking," he said. 2 shelves over, Grace opened a metal-filed box labeled simply, Ledgers. She flipped through record books, thick with handwritten columns and faded ink. It was Eleanor who recognized the signature on the corner of one. This was his, she said, voice thin. Charles's personal ledger. He never let anyone see these. Not even me. They opened it together. The entries were damning. Payments to city officials. Quiet settlements with former employees. An entry for 1984 that simply read, "Funds transferred to shell account." Prepared documents to discredit MR. Malcolm turned to the next page. A list of names. Checkmarks beside some. A line drawn through others. "These are the people who could have spoken up," Eleanor whispered. "And the ones who did." Thomas turned away, rubbing his eyes. "I remember some of these folks. Thought they just moved. Some didn't even get to say goodbye. Grace felt her stomach tighten. They were erased. Just like Malcolm. Silence settled over the attic. The kind that wasn't empty, but heavy, like a held breath, waiting. "We've got the deed," Malcolm finally said. "And now we've got the truth." But the moment was fleeting. Downstairs, a door slammed. Thomas snapped his head toward the stairwell. "No one else is supposed to be here. Not at this hour." Eleanor switched off her flashlight. Grace reached for her phone, only to see a text flash across the screen. "You're not safe. Leave now." Malcolm met her eyes. He didn't ask who sent it. He just nodded. "Time's up." They packed what they could. Grace stuffed the ledger into her coat. Malcolm folded the deed and tucked it carefully inside a pocket sewn into the lining of his shirt. Eleanor took a folder of documents Grace hadn't even seen yet. Then Thomas led them to the service stairwell, an old fire escape rarely used and barely lit. As they descended into darkness, Grace thought of how strange it was to carry the truth like this. Not as something weightless and freeing, but as a burden. Fragile, dangerous, and precious. When they reached the alley behind the hotel, the rain had returned, soft and steady. Eleanor pulled a scarf over her head. Thomas stood at the edge of the street, eyes scanning the quiet like a man looking for ghosts. "I'll stay," he said. "If they come back, I'll delay them." "Thomas," Malcolm said, his voice low, "you don't owe me that." "Maybe not," the old guard replied, "but I owe it to the truth." Grace reached for his hand. It was rough, calloused, and warm. "Be safe," she whispered. He nodded once, then turned and slipped back into the building like a shadow. They moved quickly down the block, Eleanor guiding them toward a car she had parked around the corner. Inside the vehicle, with the heater humming and the city lights reflecting off rain-slicked windows, no one spoke for several long minutes. Malcolm finally broke the silence. "I remember the day we signed that deed," he said, voice distant. Charles shook my hand and said, "We're going to change this city, Malcolm. Brick by brick." He looked down at the folded paper in his hands. He changed it all right, just not the way he promised. Grace reached over, resting her hand on his. "Now it's our turn." Outside, the rain kept falling, cleansing, quiet, as if the city itself was finally ready to wash away the lies and listen to the truth. And in that quiet car, with an old deed, a damning ledger, and the power of 4 unwavering hearts, a new chapter began. One it would write together. The night air shimmered with anticipation as the Crestmont Hotel glowed from within, its grand facade illuminated in gold and violet. It was the 50th anniversary gala, and the city's elite had gathered under the chandeliers for what was supposed to be a celebration of legacy and elegance. Waiters moved gracefully between the mingling guests, balancing trays of champagne, flutes, and canapes. Laughter mingled with the soft hum of a string quartet playing from the corner of the ballroom. Grace Holloway stood near the entrance, her breath steady but her heart pounding like a distant drumbeat. In a sleek black gown borrowed from Eleanor Sharp, she looked every bit the part of a guest. But her eyes told a different story. Beneath the glimmer of earrings and glossed lips was a woman carrying the weight of a dangerous truth. Across the ballroom, Malcolm Reed had found a quiet corner. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, his first in decades, and stood taller than anyone remembered. His silver-streaked hair was slicked back, and though his weathered face betrayed the years he had lost, his gaze was resolute. To the guests who didn't recognize him, he was just another distinguished elder. To the few who did, he was a ghost returned. Franklin DeWitt, the journalist who had built a career uncovering the uncomfortable truths of America's institutions, checked his equipment for the 3rd time. The microserver he wore beneath his jacket buzzed softly, waiting for his signal. Once activated, it would project the contents of Charles Whitmore's ledger and the unaltered deed across every screen in the ballroom. At precisely 8:30 p.m., Preston Whitmore stepped onto the central stage. Dressed in a midnight tuxedo with a diamond-encrusted tie pin, he radiated confidence. Flashbulbs burst from the crowd as photographers captured him waving and smiling. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, lifting his glass, "tonight we honor 50 years of excellence, service, and a legacy my grandfather began right here at the Crestmont. Grace felt her breath catch. She looked to Malcolm, who nodded once. Franklin adjusted his collar, then tapped a hidden button near his belt. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, just as the music stopped. One by one, the massive projection screens surrounding the ballroom lit up. But instead of Preston's face or promotional images of the hotel, they displayed something else entirely. A high-resolution image of the original 1972 land deed. Two names were clearly legible: Charles Whitmore and Malcolm Reed. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Franklin's voice, calm and clear, came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are seeing is not a mistake. It is the truth, long buried but never forgotten." Guests turned toward the stage, confused and intrigued. "My name is Franklin DeWitt. I am an independent investigative journalist, and tonight I bring you the true history of the Crestmont Hotel." The screens changed. Page after page of Charles Whitmore's ledger appeared. Entries detailing bribes to city officials, the forged documents used to frame Malcolm Reed, the meetings where it was decided that his name would be wiped from ownership records. Gasps filled the room. Some guests stepped back, clutching their pearls or drinks, while others stared in shock. A few looked directly at Preston, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a stony mask of disbelief and fury. "This is absurd," Preston finally spat. "Security, remove these people at once." But before anyone could move, the ballroom doors swung open with a heavy thud. A team of men and women in dark suits entered, flashing FBI badges. At their helm stood Special Agent Loretta Mays, her presence calm and unwavering. "Preston Whitmore," she announced, her voice slicing through the stunned silence. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and the unlawful seizure of property. You have the right to remain silent." The room erupted. Some guests gasped audibly. Others whispered frantically. A few attempted to leave, only to be gently stopped by agents securing the area. Preston's face paled. He raised a trembling hand, pointing at Malcolm. "This man is a liar. A criminal." Malcolm stepped forward, his voice firm and clear. "I was a businessman, a father, a husband. I lost everything because your grandfather couldn't stand sharing success with a black man. I was erased, but I am here now, not for revenge, but for truth." He held up a worn leather notebook, the same one he'd scribbled in for decades while sleeping within sight of the hotel. "And this," he said, raising the book, "this is my memory, my proof. I remembered everything, even when no one remembered me." Agent Mays handcuffed Preston without another word. As they led him away, guests parted like water before him. No one raised a hand to help. Grace watched, tears brimming, as Malcolm stood in the center of the ballroom. She walked toward him, the crowd making space. Without hesitation, she reached for his hand. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Malcolm replied, voice thick with emotion. "We did." Eleanor appeared beside them, her cane clicking against the marble. "It's been a long road, Malcolm, but you made it back." He looked out across the room, no longer grand or intimidating, but simply a space where truth had finally been heard. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. And in that golden, silent moment, with the past unveiled and the future uncertain but full of hope, Malcolm Reed finally stood not as a forgotten man, but as the rightful co-founder of the Crestmont Hotel. The truth, no longer buried, had been spoken, and it echoed through every crystal and column of the ballroom like a bell long overdue. The city remembers. The morning after the gala, Malcolm sat quietly on a bench outside the Crestmont, the rising sun painting the hotel in a warm amber hue. His hands, still weathered and calloused from years spent surviving the streets, rested on his lap. For the first time in decades, they trembled not from cold or fear, but from something unfamiliar, possibility. Grace sat beside him, her coat wrapped tight around her as the fall breeze swept in from the harbor. In her hand was a folded copy of the Morning Ledger. Bold across the front page, "Truth Reclaimed, the man who owned the Crestmont." "You made the front page, Mr. Reed," she said softly, unfolding it so he could see the photo of him standing under the grand chandelier, his name finally restored. He chuckled, eyes never leaving the sky. Took him long enough. But the quiet morning was short-lived. By noon, people began arriving. Not tourists or reporters, but elders from neighborhoods long forgotten by progress. Men and women with canes and walkers, leaning on grandchildren or old friends, came to stand in front of the Crestmont. They wore Sunday, best though it was Saturday. For them, this wasn't just a moment, it was history. One by one, they approached Malcolm. A woman in her 80s, eyes cloudy but spirit sharp, took his hand. "I remember when you opened Reed and Sons Realty. My brother got his first home because of you. You were the only one who would lend him a fair loan." Another man, his voice shaky with age, said, "When they locked you up, we knew it wasn't real. We just didn't have the power to stop it." Grace watched as a line formed, stretching down the block. Some carried old photographs, yellowed business cards, even faded newspaper clippings. They had kept these things, not because they thought they'd be useful, but because they refused to forget. In the silence of their homes and hearts, they had preserved his story. The hotel staff stood at the windows, stunned. This was no protest, no riot. It was a pilgrimage. By mid-afternoon, the front steps of the Crestmont had become a gathering place. Someone brought a speaker and played Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come." Voices hummed along, cracked with age but rich with memory. The song drifted into the city like incense. Miguel arrived with his camera, documenting everything. Not as an employee of the hotel. He had quit that morning, but as a historian on a mission. "This isn't just about Malcolm," he said to Grace. "It's about all of them, everyone who got erased." The mayor called. At first, Malcolm didn't answer. But Grace insisted. "You deserve to hear it." The mayor's voice on speaker was sheepish but sincere. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to invite you to speak at City Hall this Thursday. We owe you more than an apology. We owe you the truth." Malcolm considered it. "I'll come, but I ain't dressing up." That night, the local news ran a special, "The Lost Legacy of Malcolm Reed." It featured interviews with former employees, customers, neighbors. Stories of a man who had built businesses, funded scholarships, fed the hungry, and had it all taken away. Grace sat beside him as they watched. Malcolm was quiet until an old clip played, a younger version of himself at a community fair, handing out backpacks to school kids. "I forgot I had that suit," he murmured. She smiled. "You look good in blue." For the first time since his return, he didn't sleep on a bench. One the suites had been left unlocked by a sympathetic manager. The same room that once housed dignitaries now held a man the city once discarded. He stood at the window before bed, watching the people still gathered outside, candles in hand, faces lifted toward the building like it was a shrine. "They came back for me," he whispered. Grace, standing in the doorway, replied, "They never forgot you." In the morning, the candles were still burning. The heart restored. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the Crestmont Hotel, now stripped of its velvet ropes and mirrored pretensions. In place of the glinting champagne flutes and hushed, exclusive whispers were voices, many voices, filling the once hollow halls with laughter, ideas, and above all, purpose. Malcolm Reed stood on the mezzanine balcony overlooking the grand lobby, the same spot where he had once been dragged away in the rain, clutching a brittle deed and the last shreds of his dignity. Today, that space below teemed with life. Children from the local elementary school sketching the hotel's ornate crown moldings as part of an art program. A job training session for formerly incarcerated individuals in one corner, and in the center a roundtable discussion on housing justice, led by young activists. He breathed it all in, the scent of old wood polished anew, the faint aroma of coffee from the open cafe now occupying what was once the members-only lounge, and the sound, his favorite, the city breathing again through this place. Grace Holloway approached from behind, holding a clipboard and wearing a grin that hadn't left her face for days. "The third floor is ready for the clinic," she said. "Free health screenings start next Monday." Dr. Patel confirmed. Malcolm nodded slowly, as if each word were a thread sewing up a wound that had once seemed too deep to close. In the community kitchens, already serving breakfast. First come, first served, but no one leaves hungry, she added. He turned to face her, his eyes glistening. This is your doing too, Grace. You believed before anyone else did. Grace shook her head gently. I didn't believe in a building, Malcolm. I believed in a man who wouldn't let the world erase him. Miguel Alvarez entered just then, holding a microphone in one hand and his phone in the other. Sorry I'm late. Was interviewing MS. Dupree from 12th Street. She's got stories about the Crestmont from the 60s that'll blow your mind. That'll be the next podcast episode. Good, Malcolm said. People need to remember, not just what was taken, but who we've always been. Miguel pointed to the new bronze plaque at the base of the grand staircase. It read, The Crestmont Center for Justice and Restoration, dedicated to those whose voices were silenced but never surrendered. A young woman approached hesitantly, holding the hand of a boy no older than 7. Mr. Reed. Malcolm turned with his familiar calm. Yes, ma'am. I just want to say thank you. I was 17 when my brother was arrested for something he didn't do. We didn't know how to fight it. But today, your people helped me find a lawyer for him. We've got a hearing next month. Malcolm knelt to the boy's level. You proud of your mama? The boy nodded fiercely. Good. You keep being proud of her. And one day, people will be proud of you too. The mother wiped a tear. He told me he wants to be a teacher. Then this place has already done its job, Malcolm said. As they walked away, Grace leaned in. You could have taken the settlement. Lived easy the rest of your life. Easy, Malcolm murmured, watching the child disappear into the growing crowd. That would have been a waste. That afternoon, Malcolm met with a group of entrepreneurs in what was once the hotel's private cigar room. The air was filled with ideas, a mobile farmer's market, a tech skills boot camp, a neighborhood co-op. Many of the faces around the table were young, ambitious, and had never before stepped foot in the Crestmont. Not because they didn't want to, but because they never felt welcome. Now they belonged here. They were shaping it. Later, Malcolm visited the rooftop garden, once a helipad for elite guests. Now a lush space filled with herbs, vegetables, and fruit trees. Students from the local high school were tending to the rows, their sleeves rolled up, their hands in the soil. This was your idea, wasn't it? He asked Miguel, who had followed him up. Sort of. Miguel grinned. You said you wanted the Crestmont to feed people. I figured, why not start from the top down? Malcolm chuckled. You got that from my sermon, didn't you? Every word, Miguel said proudly. That evening, as the sun melted behind the skyline, Malcolm sat alone in the library. Books donated by Black authors lined the walls. On the table before him sat the original deed, now framed, and Charles Whitmore's ledger, sealed in protective casing. But it was a faded photograph that Malcolm held in his hands. Him and Charles, shaking hands in front of the freshly opened hotel, nearly 50 years ago. 2 men, 1 dream, though only one had meant to share it. Grace entered quietly, bringing him a cup of tea. You okay? He nodded, just remembering. I lost so many years, Grace. People I loved. Things I never got to say. She took the seat across from him. But look what you've made from those losses. Look what's here now. Still, he whispered, eyes on the photo. There's a part of me that aches for the man I might have been. Grace reached across the table, her hand over his. You became something more, Malcolm. You became a compass. And now we're all finding our way again. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Malcolm placed the photo back in the drawer, and together they rose. Outside, the city pulsed with new energy. Lights glowed from the windows of the Crestmont, not as a fortress of exclusion, but as a lighthouse. A place reclaimed, a purpose restored, and a legacy reborn, not in marble, but in mercy. The door stays open. The morning after Malcolm Reed's landmark speech, sunlight poured through the towering windows of a newly christened Reed Center for Justice and Opportunity. The air was different now, no longer thick with silence and secrets, but alive with voices, footsteps, purpose. Children's laughter echoed from the East Wing, where a literacy program had just launched. Downstairs, a group of formerly incarcerated men and women sat in a circle, discussing reentry strategies with mentors who had walked the same path. In the dining hall, staff prepared for the first community brunch, a tradition Malcolm insisted on starting. People talk better over biscuits, he'd said with a wink. Malcolm stood near the old grand piano in the lobby, his hand resting on the polished wood. He wore a suit today, not new, but pressed with care. His shoes still had a scuff near the toe, a reminder of the years he walked without destination. Grace Holloway approached from behind, holding a steaming mug of tea. "You've been standing here a while," she said gently. "Just listening," Malcolm replied. "This building used to whisper ghosts. Now it sings." Grace offered a quiet smile and handed him the tea. "They're waiting for you upstairs. You're 10 o'clock. Let them wait 2 more minutes," Malcolm said, his eyes not leaving the piano. "It took me 40 years to get back inside. I want to feel it a little longer." Upstairs, the boardroom had been converted into a multi-use space. Today, it served as a gathering place for community leaders, educators, and former activists. The agenda wasn't about business profits. It was about stories, strategies, and second chances. Miguel Alvarez set up a portable recorder on the table, another episode for his podcast, Echoes Unheard. He gave Malcolm a thumbs up. "You ready to go live, Mr. Reed?" Malcolm chuckled. "Ready as I'll ever be." They talked about reinvesting in forgotten neighborhoods, about restorative justice, and the idea of shared ownership. But it was the final 10 minutes that stirred the room. A woman named Lorraine Jacobs, now in her 70s, stood and cleared her throat. "I was 16 when you were arrested, Mr. Reed," she began. "My father said they framed you, but folks were too scared to say anything. I was too scared, but I always remembered. And when I saw you on the news last week, I felt like maybe silence had an expiration date." Malcolm stood slowly and walked toward her. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's never too late to speak truth." She hugged him like a daughter who had waited decades to come home. Later that evening, Malcolm wandered the rooftop garden, another recent transformation. The city sprawled around him, glowing gold and rust in the setting sun. A soft breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the planters. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Grace asked, stepping beside him. "Every day," Malcolm said. "But I also think about what is. And that's enough for me now." Grace nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You know this place? It's changing lives already. But I think it changed mine first. I used to think history was something that just happened. But it's not. It's something we live. We write." Malcolm smiled, the kind that wrinkles every line in a man's face. "You wrote this chapter, Grace. I just helped turn the page." As the weeks passed, the Reed Center became a heartbeat in the city's chest. Veterans found housing through its partnerships. Local artists held exhibits in what used to be the exclusive ballrooms. A mother's cooperative launched a daycare and job training initiative. And through it all, Malcolm remained a steady presence. He no longer walked with the guarded caution of a man expecting the worst. His steps were slower now, but sure. When a child asked if he was the man from the big picture in the lobby, he laughed and knelt down, explaining what it meant to build something worth sharing. One afternoon, a group of high school students toured the building. In the grand hall, they sat cross-legged on the floor as Malcolm spoke. "This place isn't just bricks and memory," he told them. "It's proof that the truth can outlive a lie, that dignity can survive betrayal, and that even if the world writes you off, you can still write yourself back in." A boy in the back raised his hand. "Mr. Reed, what do you want people to remember most about you?" Malcolm paused, looked around the room. "That I left the door open." On a quiet Sunday morning, Malcolm sat in his office, watching the light move across the old land deed framed behind glass. Eleanor Sharp, now in her 80s, visited with lemon bars and letters from former staff who had found new purpose. They talked about names they hadn't spoken in years. Names once buried, now blooming in stories passed down. That night, a surprise celebration unfolded in the main ballroom, a dedication in Malcolm's honor. But the plaque didn't carry his name alone. It read, "To all those who were told they didn't belong, the door is open. Come in." Dedicated in honor of Malcolm Reed and the silent fighters who walked before him. Asterisk, asterisk. As the applause died down, Malcolm took the microphone. He was quiet a moment. Then, if you'd asked me 10 years ago where I'd be today, I'd have told you I didn't think I'd live this long. But here we are, not because I deserved more than anyone else, but because enough people chose to see me, really see me. And that seeing, it changes everything. He looked at Grace, at Miguel, at Eleanor and Thomas, at the children and elders, the lawyers and janitors, the dreamers and doers. There's no such thing as a stolen future that can't be reclaimed, he finished. Sometimes it takes a lifetime, but it's never too late, never too far gone. And as the room stood once more in applause, not for the first time and not the last, the lights of the Reed Center glowed like a lighthouse in the middle of a city that had finally remembered its forgotten sons. The door stayed open, and people kept walking through, the quiet echo of belonging. The late morning light slanted through the high windows of the Crestmont Hotel's East Wing, brushing over the polished wood panels with a kind of reverent grace. The city beyond pulsed and hummed, but in this space, Malcolm Reed's new office, time moved differently. It was slower here, more deliberate. Every object in the room had been placed with intention, from the small framed photo of his late wife nestled on the corner shelf to the worn leather armchair across from his desk, reserved for those who needed listening more than advice. Malcolm stood in front of the freshly mounted plaque on the far wall. The inscription, etched in warm bronze, glinted faintly as sunlight caught it, in honor of those whose names were erased. May they never be forgotten. Just beside it hung the original deed to the Crestmont, encased in glass, the yellowed parchment a quiet testament to what had been stolen and reclaimed. There was no ceremony today, no cameras, no applause, only stillness. And in that stillness, Malcolm breathed. Behind him, the door creaked open with the soft scrape of worn hinges. "You okay, Mr. Reed?" Grace's voice was gentle, but steady. She stepped into the room, clipboard in hand, curls pinned up, eyes watchful and kind. She was no longer just the receptionist with questions in her heart. She had become the face of connection, the one who linked past and present with Grace. "I'm better than okay," Malcolm said, turning to face her. "Just remembering, this place holds so much. Not just what happened to me, but to so many others, some who never got to come home." Grace nodded and crossed the room, standing beside him in front of the plaque. "They'd be proud of you, of what this place has become." Malcolm chuckled softly. "I hope so. I used to walk past this building every day, thinking I was invisible. Turns out, I just needed to be seen by the right people." At that moment, Miguel appeared at the door, his camera bag slung across his shoulder, a bundle of flyers tucked beneath his arm. "The oral history exhibit is almost ready," he announced. "We're launching it next week. Room 214 is being converted into a listening lounge. We have interviews from elders across the city, stories about the neighborhood, small businesses, even old music halls that got bulldozed." Malcolm's eyes lit up. "That's the spirit of this place now. Not just marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but memory. Truth." Miguel nodded. "It's already changing things. A high school wants to bring their students in. One woman said she hadn't spoken about her father's wrongful eviction in 50 years, but your story gave her the courage." Malcolm turned back toward the desk and sat down, hands folded. The weight of his years rested in his shoulders, but something else lived in his chest now, a quiet, persistent lightness. "You know," he said, glancing at Grace and Miguel, "this place doesn't belong to me. Not really. It belongs to everyone who's ever been told they didn't matter. Everyone who lost something they couldn't name. It belongs to Truth. And you too. You've made sure that Truth had a voice." Grace smiled, walking to the window and gazing down at the street where passers-by strolled by the building, some pausing to look at the new mural painted on the outer wall. It was a cascade of faces, black, brown, young, old, interwoven with flowers, flames, and doves. At the mural's center stood Malcolm, his hands open not in defiance, but welcome. Downstairs in the main lobby, a group of students filed in. A volunteer guide began speaking softly about the building's past, not avoiding the dark parts, but folding them gently into the narrative like shadows in the shape of understanding. This wasn't a place of shame anymore. It was a place where wounds became wisdom. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. "Come in," Malcolm said. A middle-aged woman entered, holding a worn manila envelope to her chest. Her hands trembled slightly. "Mr. Reed?" she said, eyes uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my name is Celia Moore. My grandfather used to own a barber shop on Langston Street. I heard what you did, what this place stands for now, and I thought, maybe it's not too late to tell his story." Malcolm stood slowly and extended his hand. "It's never too late, MS. Moore, come sit. Tell me everything." Miguel stepped forward. "Mind if I record it?" She hesitated, then nodded. He cut hair for 32 years. Never raised his prices, not even when rent tripled. They forced him out in the late 90s. He died 2 years later. "Heartbreak," we said. As she spoke, her voice began to steady. Miguel quietly started recording, while Grace jotted notes. That afternoon, the office didn't feel like an office. It felt like a hearth, warm, waiting, willing to hold what had been carried too long in silence. When Celia finished, she reached into the envelope and pulled out an old photograph. Her grandfather stood in front of the shop, a child's hand resting in his. A sign above them read, "Moore and Son, since 1962. Tears welled in Malcolm's eyes. "He mattered," he whispered. Celia nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I just wanted someone to remember." "We will," Grace said. "We'll archive this. Tell his story in the exhibit." As evening settled outside, and the city bathed itself in gold and soft blue, the office door remained open. One by one, people arrived. An old jazz singer with vinyls under his arm, a retired teacher with her late husband's letters, a granddaughter holding the key to a restaurant long gone. Malcolm listened to each story with care, his eyes never once straying from theirs. Not once. And as the hours passed, the walls of that room seemed to breathe. They stretched to make space for grief and for joy, for silence, and for the music of names once lost, now spoken again. It was not just a chapter begun. It was a promise kept. The door stayed open long into the night, and nobody who walked through it left unseen. A legacy of justice, a lesson for today. The story of Malcolm Reed is more than a man's journey to reclaim his name. It is a mirror reflecting deeper truths our modern society continues to wrestle with. Delayed justice, silenced voices, and the enduring power of perseverance. In an age where narratives are manipulated, biases persist, and history can be rewritten by the powerful, Malcolm's story reminds us that truth, no matter how long it's been buried, can be unearthed by the hands of faith and resilience. Malcolm never asked for pity. He wasn't looking for fame. All he wanted was to be heard, a seemingly simple thing, yet still a privilege for far too many in today's world. We live in a society where marginalized communities, the elderly, and the forgotten still wait for someone to listen. Malcolm teaches us that every person, regardless of age, status, or circumstance, has a story worth telling and a truth worth honoring. This story is also a powerful reminder of the essential role younger generations play. People like Grace and Miguel, who are willing to question, to uncover, and to stand up for what's right, even at great personal cost. They represent a generation unwilling to accept the status quo, determined instead to rewrite the narrative with courage and compassion. In real life, we've seen this echoed in recent movements, from racial justice to workers' rights, fueled by those who dare to listen and uplift long-silenced voices. Today, we don't need a grand hotel to symbolize change. Any place, a classroom, a coffee shop, a quiet living room, can become a space for truth to be spoken and justice to take root. Malcolm Reed's story is a lesson in never giving up on the value of your voice and never underestimating the power of a community that chooses to love and stand together. And perhaps the most moving part of it all is this. A man who seemed to have lost everything became the spark that helped an entire city remember how to begin again, with compassion, memory, and hope. That is the truest and most lasting kind of legacy. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields, drop a comment. Below, I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.